10 years ago, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Emma Carter let out a delighted giggle as she ran barefoot to the cornfield behind her family's farmhouse. At only 6 years old, with wild red curls and a face full of freckles, she was the kind of child who could never sit still. Her mother, Laura Carter, called her a little firecracker, always chasing adventure. That day was no different. "Emma, don't go too far," Laura called from the back porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Yes, Mama," Emma shouted back before disappearing into the thick rows of towering cornstalks. It was a routine scene. Emma playing, the golden fields surrounding their little farmhouse, and Laura preparing dinner, occasionally glancing outside to check on her daughter. There was no scream, no struggle, no sign of distress. Just silence. By the time the sun began dipping behind the hills, Emma was gone. A town in chaos of search for Emma consumed Willow Creek. Hundreds of volunteers, law enforcement, and search dogs combed to the cornfields, nearby barns, and every stretch of open land. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Laura refused to give up. She left the porch light on every night, convinced Emma would find her way home. She chased down every lead, fought with detectives who insisted there was no new evidence, and watched as people slowly moved on. Her husband, David Carter, couldn't handle the grief. It ate away at their marriage until he packed his bags one night and left. By the 5th year, most of the town had accepted the inevitable. Emma was gone. But Laura never stopped searching. A whisper from the past on the 10th anniversary of Emma's disappearance. Something changed. Laura sat alone at the town's only cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, when Sheriff Tom Grayson approached her table. The lines on his face were deeper now, his once dark hair now streaked with gray. He had led the search for Emma all those years ago, and though he had never said it out loud, Laura knew he believed Emma was dead. "Morning, Laura," he said hesitantly, sliding into the seat across from her. She barely glanced up. "Sheriff, I got a call this morning." Something about his tone made her grip the coffee cup tighter. "What kind of call?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "From a janitor at the old Miller farm. Said he saw something strange." Laura's heart pounded. The Miller farm had been abandoned for years, its barns empty, its fields overgrown. "What did he see?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Grayson hesitated. "A girl, a red-haired girl, locked up in the pig barn." The world tilted. Laura felt like she couldn't breathe. "Where?" she managed to choke out. "Just outside town. We're heading there now." Laura was already on her feet. The abandoned pig barn, the drive to the Miller farm, felt endless. The old property sat on the outskirts of town, a place people avoided because of its eerie emptiness. As Laura pulled up behind the sheriff's cruiser, she could already feel the weight of 10 years of unanswered questions crushing her. The barn loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls stained with time, its wooden doors slightly ajar. The janitor, an old man with shaky hands and eyes filled with fear, stood near the entrance. "I swear to you, I ain't making this up," he muttered. She was right there in the corner, curled up like a scared animal. Laura's stomach twisted. Was it possible? Could Emma really be here? Sheriff Grayson pushed the door open, and the stench hit them first. Damp hay, rust, and something foul. The dim lighting barely illuminated the filthy enclosure, and then Laura's eyes locked onto something in the shadows. A girl, thin, pale, with tangled red hair. She flinched at the sudden movement, her wrists bound in rusted chains. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The girl turned wide, haunted eyes toward them, and then she spoke. "Mama?" Laura Carter felt her breath hitch in her throat. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to blink, afraid that if she did, the girl in front of her would vanish like a cruel mirage. "Mama?" The voice was soft, weak, uncertain, like it hadn't been used in years. Laura's legs almost gave out beneath her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, dreamed of Emma running back into her arms, whole and scathed. But this? The girl in the dimly lit barn was not the same child who had vanished into the cornfield 10 years ago. She was older now, her once plump cheeks sunken, her skin pale under the layer of grime. Her wild red curls were now tangled and matted, falling in uneven clumps around her face. Her wrists bore bruises where rusted shackles dug into them. Her arms, too thin for a child her age, wrapped around her knees as though she were trying to make herself disappear. Laura took a shaky step forward. "Emma?" The girl flinched, her blue eyes darting toward the janitor and the sheriff as if expecting punishment. She pressed herself against the wall, her breathing quick and shallow. Laura turned toward Sheriff Grayson, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Why is she chained? Who did this to her?" Grayson exhaled heavily, his hand resting on his holster. "We don't know yet. We need to get her out of here first." The janitor, an old man named Walter Hayes, shifted uneasily. I just coming to clean like usual," he stammered. "Didn't expect to find." He trailed off, rubbing his hands together nervously. Laura didn't care about explanations. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees in front of the girl. "Sweetheart, it's me. It's Mommy." The girl shrank back further. Her eyes flickered with something almost like recognition, but then fear. Why was she afraid? The shackles of the past Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the rusted chains binding the girl's wrists. "Sheriff, help me get these off." Grayson hesitated. "We need to be careful. We don't know if she's my daughter." Laura snapped. "She's been missing for 10 years. And she's sitting here in a filthy pig barn, chained like an animal." Her voice cracked on the last word. The sheriff didn't argue. He took a bolt cutter from Walter and carefully snapped the metal links. The moment the chains fell away, the girl yanked her arms close to her chest, rubbing the raw skin. Laura reached out, but the girl flinched again. "Emma, it's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." Silence. Then in a small, hoarse voice, the girl whispered, "I can't go." Laura's heart stopped. "What?" The girl's haunted eyes darted toward the barn doors, then back at Laura. "He'll come back." A chill ran down Laura's spine. Sheriff Grayson stiffened. "Who?" The girl swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. "The man who keeps me here." 10 years of darkness, the weight of her words, sent a jolt of ice through Laura's veins. Emma hadn't just been missing. She had been kept. Taken. Held captive for a decade. Laura clenched her fists, nausea rising in her stomach. Who could have done this? Sheriff Grayson turned toward Walter. "How often you come out here?" Walter scratched his head. "Couple times a week. Just to clean up, make sure the pipes ain't busted." He paused. "But I never seen no girl before today. I swear it." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "You never heard anything? Not once." Walter shifted, suddenly looking nervous. "I mean, place makes noises, you know? Old buildings creak, animals scurry round. I didn't think nothing of it." Laura clenched her teeth. Had her daughter been screaming for help all this time? Had no one heard her? She turned back to Emma, speaking gently. "Sweetheart, do you know his name?" Emma didn't move. "Is he here?" Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening into fists. Then a loud crash from outside. The monster returned Sheriff Grayson was the first to react, drawing his gun. Laura spun toward the barn doors, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The sound had come from outside, metal against metal, like something heavy being knocked over. Grayson motioned for everyone to stay back as he inched toward the door. The barn was old, the wooden walls riddled with gaps that allowed slivers of light to pierce through. Laura strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. Then a shadow moved just outside the door. Grayson whipped his gun up. "Who's there?" Silence. Laura's breathing became ragged. Every fiber of her being screamed danger. Then Emma did something that sent shivers down her mother's spine. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the farthest wall, shaking her head wildly. No, 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 no. The doors burst open, and for the first time in 10 years, Laura came face to face with the man who had stolen her daughter. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The man standing in the barn doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed by the harsh afternoon light. He wore a battered flannel shirt, jeans caked with dried mud, and work boots that had tracked filth across the wooden floor. His face was hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap, but Laura could feel his presence like a sickness in her bones. Emma let out a strangled whimper and pressed herself so tightly against the barn wall that it looked like she was trying to disappear. Her body shook violently, and her breathing turned shallow, not just fear but pure terror. Laura's instincts kicked in. She threw herself between her daughter and the man. "Who the hell are you?" Sheriff Grayson barked, aiming his gun. The man didn't flinch. He tilted his head as if amused. Then he stepped forward. Grayson cocked his gun. "That's close enough. Hands where I can see them." The man obeyed, but slowly, lifting his hands as if he had all the time in the world. That's when Laura saw it, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't afraid. He was entertained. "I was wondering when someone come poking around." His voice was deep, smooth, and disturbingly calm. Figured it'd happen sooner or later. Laura's stomach twisted. How could he be so unfazed? So casual? Grayson tightened his grip on the gun. "You live here?" The man shrugged. "Used to." His gaze flicked past the sheriff to Emma. She curled into herself and let out a broken sob. Laura's world spun. It was him, the thing that had stolen her baby, the shadow that had haunted her nightmares. Before she even realized what she was doing, she lunged. A mother's wrath had happened so fast. Her body moved on instinct, fueled by 10 years of rage and grief. She grabbed a rusted tool from a nearby workbench, a wrench maybe or a crowbar, and swung with everything she had. She felt it connect with his side, a sickening crack. The man let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. "Laura," Grayson barked. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She raised the weapon again, this time aiming for his head. But he was faster. A large, callous hand shot out, gripping her wrist mid-swing. His fingers dug in like a vice, crushing bone, stealing control. Then he spoke in a whisper that sent ice through her veins. "Careful now, Mama Bear. Wouldn't want to do something you regret." "Mama Bear." Laura froze. She had heard that before. Her stomach twisted as a horrible realization sank in. She knew this voice. Not from nightmares. Not from some faceless monster. From real life. From before. Sheriff Grayson shoved the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. "Let her go." For a second, the man held on, just long enough to remind Laura how strong he was. Then, slowly, he released his grip and took a step back. His smirk returned. "Ain't no need for that, Sheriff." "Who are you?" Grayson demanded. The man adjusted his hat. Then, finally, he spoke his name, and Laura's entire world shattered. A ghost from the past, she staggered backward, gasping as if she'd been punched in the gut. "No!" The word barely made it past her lips. It couldn't be. Not him. Not. Been a long time, Laura. The barn spun. She felt like she was going to throw up, because standing in front of her was Sam Weaver, Emma's father. Secrets in the cornfield room seemed to close in around Laura, the father of her child, the man she had once loved, the man who had walked out of their lives before Emma's second birthday, the man she had told herself was dead. And now here he was. Grayson's face darkened. "You know him?" Laura's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sam took off his cap, revealing the same sharp jawline, the same dark green eyes Laura had once traced with her fingers in the quiet of the night. She remembered the day he left. No note, no warning, just gone, gone. Or so she had thought. Her legs felt weak. Sam, a slow, mocking grin spread across his face. Surprise? Behind her, Emma let out a broken, gut-wrenching sob. Laura snapped out of it. She whirled around, dropping to her knees beside her daughter. Emma was shaking so violently she could barely stay upright. She had been terrified before, but now she was unraveling. Laura's heart pounded against her ribs. She turned back to Sam, her voice raw. You did this." His expression remained unreadable. "Now, Laura, you took her?" Something flickered in his eyes. Then he shrugged. "I came back for my girl." Laura felt her soul fracture. "No!" she whispered. "You stole her." Sam chuckled, as if amused. You don't understand, don't. Laura's voice shook with rage. Don't you dare try to justify this. Sheriff Grayson stepped forward, his voice like steel. You're under arrest. Sam smirked. You got proof, Sheriff? Grayson's jaw tightened. You were holding a missing girl captive in a barn. Sam lifted his hands again in that same slow, deliberate way. Funny thing about that. Then he looked at Emma. Laura felt her daughter shrink away. And then Emma, in the smallest, most broken voice, whispered, I wasn't stolen. Laura's entire body felt like it was made of glass, fragile, on the verge of shattering. She turned to Emma, searching for something. Asterisk, asterisk, anything. Asterisk, asterisk that would explain the words that had just left her daughter's lips. I wasn't stolen. The phrase hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick with something unspoken, something terrible. Emma wouldn't look at her. Her small, dirt-streaked hands clenched into fists. Laura's stomach twisted. No, baby, no, she whispered, reaching for her. Emma flinched. The reaction slammed into Laura like a punch. Tears burned her eyes, but she forced herself to stay steady. What do you mean, Emma? You were kidnapped. You were taken from me. Emma shook her head. Laura's breath hitched. Then, in a small, hollow voice, Emma said, I was left behind. A mother's worst nightmare, Laura, felt like the air had been sucked from a room. Left behind? That was impossible. She had searched, screamed, torn the entire town apart looking for her baby. She had never given up. That's not true. Her voice cracked. I looked for you. I never stopped. Emma's eyes flashed with something sharp. Pain and anger. You didn't look hard enough, she said. Laura staggered back as if she had been slapped. Behind her, Sheriff Grayson's face darkened. He stepped between them, gun still raised at Sam. What the hell is going on here? Sam smiled, a slow, knowing smile, like he had been waiting for this moment, waiting to watch Laura break. He adjusted his cap, his voice maddeningly calm. Told ya, Sheriff, this ain't what you think. Grayson's jaw clenched. Then why don't you enlighten us? Sam sighed, shaking his head like this was all some big misunderstanding. Laura and I, we had our differences. He glanced at her. Didn't we, sweetheart? Laura's hands curled into fists. You left, she spat. Walked out on me. On her. Sam gave a slow nod. Sure did. Like it was nothing. Like it had meant nothing. But I came back, he added. Came back for Emma. And you know what I found? His gaze darkened. An empty cornfield. Laura felt a chill race down her spine. What? She whispered. Sam took a step forward, lowering his voice. You think I took her? He shook his head. I found her. Same as you. Buried lies, no, Laura whispered, shaking her head violently. No, that's not possible. Sam just stared at her. Then he nodded toward Emma. Ask her. Laura turned to her daughter, her hands trembling. Emma still wouldn't meet her eyes. Her body was too still, too rigid. Laura felt something deep inside her start to crack. A terrible, creeping suspicion. Emma, she said gently, tell me the truth. Tell me what happened. A beat of silence. Then, I don't remember. Laura's stomach dropped. Lies. She could hear it in Emma's voice. Her daughter remembered everything. The missing year Sheriff Grayson finally spoke. If you didn't take her, then who did? Sam exhaled. Now, that's the million-dollar question, ain't it? His voice was smooth, too smooth. Grayson narrowed his eyes. Start talking. Sam tilted his head, studying the sheriff like he was deciding how much to say. Finally, he shrugged. I came back round the time she disappeared. Thought, maybe I'd try being a father for once. Laura almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Try being a father? As if fatherhood was something you could just try. Sam continued. But when I got here, the whole town was already on fire about Emma being missing. I went looking myself. Figured, hell, maybe I'd be a hero. Bring her home, win some points with the good folks of Hartwell. His expression darkened. But then I found her first. Laura couldn't breathe. Sam leaned forward. And you know where she was, Laura? Her throat closed. Sam's voice dropped to a whisper. Right where you left her. A fractured memory, Laura's vision blurred. Her thoughts scrambled for clarity. She tried to remember that night. 10 years ago. The last time she saw Emma. She remembered Emma playing in the cornfield, laughing, golden curls bouncing in the summer sun. She remembered the horrible moment she realized her daughter was gone. She remembered running, screaming, searching, but something was missing. A gap, a void in her mind. One moment Emma was there, and the next, she wasn't. Her pulse pounded in her ears. No, she whispered. That's not. Sam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Ain't it though? Laura backed away, shaking her head. Sheriff Grayson looked between them, gripping his gun tighter. This is insane. You're saying she was never kidnapped? That Laura just left her? Sam shrugged. All I know is when I found her, she was alone. A heavy silence filled the barn. Then I waited, Emma whispered. Laura's heart stopped. I waited for you to come back, Emma continued, voice hollow. Her hands trembled at her sides. But you never did. Tears burned down Laura's face. Emma, I don't remember. Emma's breath hitched. That's the worst part. Her voice cracked. You don't remember. The word stabbed Laura straight through the heart. Because somewhere, deep down, she knew. She knew that whatever had happened that night, whatever awful, unthinkable thing had stolen her daughter away, she had played a part in it. Laura's breath was coming too fast. Her chest tight with something between panic and realization. She didn't remember. 10 years had passed, and she had no memory of what really happened the night Emma disappeared. But her daughter did. And the way Emma looked at her, like a stranger, like a threat, it was killing her. Laura staggered back, gripping the wooden post of the pig barn to steady herself. Emma, please, tell me exactly what you remember. Emma's lips parted slightly, her expression flickering between hesitation and something darker, something that looked like fear. Fear of her own mother. Sam watched them, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. He was enjoying this. Laura turned on him. You're lying. Sam just raised an eyebrow. Am I? I never left her, Laura hissed. I never would. Emma flinched, and Laura's world cracked a little more. Because the girl, the daughter she had ached for, grieved for, wasn't nodding in agreement. She wasn't saying, I know, Mom. She just stood there, silent, unmoving, like she knew the truth. And Laura didn't. The cornfield memory of cold, gnawing dread wrapped around Laura's spine. Her head throbbed. Her vision swayed. And then a memory flashed behind her eyes. A cornfield. Moonlight. Emma's small hand in hers. Laura's breath hitched. She clung to the thread of the memory, desperate. It was real. She could feel it. Emma's laughter, soft, sweet, echoed in her mind. Then a scream. Her own. Then blackness. Nothing. Laura gasped, gripping her head. She looked at Emma, chest rising and falling rapidly. I was with you that night. Emma's blue eyes darkened. Laura took a shaky step forward. I remember the field. I was holding your hand. Emma tensed. Laura reached for her. Emma, I didn't. But her daughter flinched again. And suddenly Laura knew. She knew the truth before Emma even spoke it. You let go. The words came out barely above a whisper. Laura froze. Emma's face crumpled. You were holding my hand, she said, voice trembling. And then you let go. Laura felt like she was falling. No. She shook her head violently. I didn't. You let go, Emma repeated, tears slipping down her cheeks now. And you walked away. Laura's entire body went cold. A darker truth, the barn was silent. Even the pigs had stopped moving. The only sound was Laura's own heartbeat, pounding like a war drum. She turned to Sam. What did you find when you came back? Sam's smirk disappeared. For the first time, he hesitated. Laura stepped toward him, hands clenched. Tell me? Sam exhaled. She was alone, crying. His voice had lost its smugness. Now it was low. Serious. I found her sitting right there in the cornfield, Laura. Looking around, waiting. He tilted his head. Waiting for you. Laura couldn't breathe. You didn't come back, Emma whispered. The world spun. I don't remember. Laura gasped. Emma's voice was shaking now, breaking apart. I screamed for you, Mommy. I waited. I thought maybe you got lost too, but you didn't come back. Laura's knees buckled. She caught herself against the barn wall. No, she whispered. No, Her head was splitting. Something dark was clawing its way up, pushing against the walls of her mind. A memory, a truth she had buried, a choice she had made. And then a gunshot. A sudden explosion of chaos Sheriff Grayson fired at Sam, the bullet barely missing his shoulder. Sam dove out of the way, hands in the air. Grayson barked, gun still aimed. Sam held up his hand slowly, eyes cold. Jesus, Sheriff, ain't no need for that. But Grayson's patience was gone. You left town years ago. You don't own this barn. You don't own her. He jerked his head toward Emma. You have 3 seconds to tell me exactly what the hell happened here. Sam smirked, but there was no real amusement. This ain't just about me, Sheriff. His gaze flicked back to Laura. It's about her. Laura's pulse pounded. What are you talking about? Grayson demanded. Sam took a step forward, hands still up, but his eyes were locked on Laura. Why don't you ask the lady of the hour? He said. Grayson turned toward Laura. She barely noticed, because in that moment, the final piece of the memory slid into place. The truth, asterisk, asterisk, the whole terrible truth, asterisk, asterisk, rushed back. And Laura remembered. Laura couldn't breathe, not because of the thick stench of the pig barn, nor the cold stare of the man who had taken her daughter all those years ago. It was because she remembered the night Emma disappeared, the night she was lost in that endless sea of corn. Laura had been there, and she had let go. Emma's words, spoken through tear-filled eyes, echoed in her skull. You let go. You walked away. Her body trembled, sweat beading on her forehead. No, she wanted to argue. I would never. But the truth, now unshackled from the dark depths of her subconscious, wrapped around her like a vice. The cornfield, the silver moon hanging in the sky, Emma's small hand in hers. Laura had been holding it so tight, but something had made her let go. Something had made her turn away. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to push the memory back down. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened, and now she had no choice but to face the awful truth. The night it happened, the memory came in flashes. She and Emma had been running. From who? From what? Laura's pulse hammered. She could hear her own voice, frantic, whispering, "Don't look back, baby. Just run." Emma's tiny fingers gripped hers. The corn swayed around them, whispering in the wind like it knew something she didn't. Then a shadow emerging from the stalks, a figure, and suddenly Laura's entire body had been filled with one thing: terror. Her grip on Emma's hand tightened. "Mommy?" Emma's voice had been small, confused. Laura's head snapped toward her, and her vision blurred. Her body went cold. Blackness. The memory cut off there. Her breath came in shallow gasps. That was it? That was all she could remember? No, there was more. There had to be more. The monster in the room, a slow clap, echoed through the barn. Laura's eyes snapped open. Sam. He leaned against the rusted gate of the pig pen, a smirk playing on his lips. Looks like it's all coming back to you now, ain't it? Laura's blood ran cold. You know, Sam mused, it was real interesting watching you pretend you ain't know nothing. His eyes flicked toward Emma. Poor girl waited for you, Laura. Waited all night. Thought you was going to come back for her. Emma's shoulders stiffened, and Laura's stomach twisted into knots. Sam's smirk widened. But you didn't. Laura's knees buckled. You're lying, she whispered, shaking her head. I would never leave my daughter. Sam laughed, a slow, dark chuckle that sent goosebumps skittering across her skin. Oh, darling, he said. You did. Emma stared at Laura, tears brimming in her haunted blue eyes. And for the first time, she didn't look like a little girl. She looked like someone who had been abandoned, someone who had waited, and never been saved. Laura's breath caught in her throat. "No," she rasped. "That's not true." But her own mind betrayed her, because deep, deep inside, she knew. Sam took a slow step toward her. "Tell me, Laura," he murmured. His voice was smooth, like the blade of a knife before the cut. "What exactly do you remember?" The realization that shattered her. Laura's hands were shaking. The memory, the missing piece, was so close she could almost touch it. She forced herself to dig deeper. The cornfield, the shadow, the fear, and then something sharp, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. A voice, low, menacing. "Keep walking, sweetheart, and don't look back." Laura's stomach twisted. She had been running, not just from the figure in the field, from something else, from something inside her. And then the pressure, the overwhelming heaviness in her skull, the moment her fingers had slipped from Emma's hand, and then blackness. It wasn't just fear that had taken her memory. It was something else, something done to her. Laura staggered, her fingers digging into her temples. She felt like she was going to be sick. Sam was watching her with a satisfied expression, like he already knew exactly what she was remembering. "You weren't yourself, were you?" he said softly. Laura's breath hitched. No, she wasn't. Something had been done to her, and whoever had taken Emma had gotten to Laura first. The unraveling Sheriff Grayson's voice cut through the haze. "Hands where I can see them, Sam." Sam chuckled. "Oh, Sheriff, you sure do a bad Timmond." Grayson didn't lower his gun, step away from the girl. Sam sighed dramatically and took a step back, raising his hands. "Ain't touching nobody." Laura barely heard them. She was still reeling from the memory. Someone had drugged her. Someone had taken her first. And while she was gone, they had taken Emma, too. Her hands balled into fists. The missing pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. She lifted her eyes to Sam. "Who did this to me?" she whispered. For the first time that night, Sam's expression shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of hesitation, of something deeper. Laura's pulse raced. He knew. And then the barn doors creaked open. And a new voice filled the space. Well, it's about time you figured it out, Laura." A voice she hadn't heard in 10 years. A voice she had never expected to hear again. Her body went rigid, because standing in the doorway, face half lit by the dim barn light, was someone she thought was long dead. And suddenly, everything made sense. Laura's breath caught in her throat. The barn door groaned as it swung open wider, revealing the figure standing in the shadows. Her heart stopped, because she knew that voice, knew it deep in her bones. The man stepped forward, his face half lit by the dim barn light, and Laura's world tilted. It was Nathaniel Calloway, her brother, her dead brother. She swayed on her feet. This isn't possible," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Nathaniel tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "I was wondering how long it would take you to put it all together." Laura's blood ran cold. This wasn't real. Nathaniel had died 15 years ago. A car accident. A closed casket funeral. They had buried him. But he was standing right in front of her. Alive. And that meant the truth Laura thought she knew was a lie. The memory comes full circle. Sheriff Grayson kept his gun trained on Sam, but flicked his eyes toward Nathaniel. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Nathaniel sighed, stepping fully into the light. "Ah, come on, Sheriff. You mean to tell me my own baby sister never told you about me?" Laura's pulse pounded. "You're dead," she whispered. "We buried you." Nathaniel chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, they buried someone. Just wasn't me." Her head spun. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Emma's small, trembling voice cut through the tension. "Mom, who is he?" Laura forced herself to speak through the suffocating weight of shock. "My brother," she murmured. "My brother who was supposed to be dead." Nathaniel clapped his hands together. "And yet Here I am. What a miracle, huh? Laura swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists. Where were you? She demanded. Why? Why did you let us think you were gone? Nathaniel's expression darkened. Because I had to disappear, Laura, for my own good. He stepped closer. And for yours. A chill slithered down her spine. Something in his voice made her stomach twist. You knew, she whispered. You knew about Emma, about me, about that night. Nathaniel's smirk faltered, and in that moment Laura understood. He wasn't just here by chance. He was part of this, of all of it. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her. You knew, she repeated, her voice trembling. You knew she was taken. Nathaniel's smirk faded completely. He didn't deny it, and that was all the confirmation Laura needed. She felt like she had been punched in the gut. Emma was staring at him now, her face pale, her eyes wide. Did you take me? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel didn't answer, and that silence was more damning than any words ever could be. The truth unraveled. Sam let out a dark chuckle, shaking his head. Guess the reunion's over, he mused. I'd hate to ruin the moment, but I think Laura deserves to know the rest of the story, don't you? Nathaniel shot him a glare, jaw clenching. But Sam wasn't done. Tell her, Calloway, he taunted. Tell her how it wasn't just me. Laura's breath hitched. Sam smirked at her. Your brother's been in this from the start. She felt like the air had been sucked from the room. No, that couldn't be true. Nathaniel's eyes flickered, and that's when she saw it. The guilt, the truth. She took a staggering step back. You knew, she whispered, voice cracking. You knew she was alive this whole time. You let me believe she was dead. You let me suffer. Nathaniel's face hardened. It wasn't that simple, Laura. Laura's stomach churned. It was that simple, she snapped. You chose to keep this from me. Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand, he said. I was trying to protect you. Protect me? Laura let out a bitter laugh. From what? Nathaniel's gaze locked onto hers. From them. The room fell silent. Them. Who was them? Sheriff Grayson's grip on his gun tightened. Who the hell are you talking about? Nathaniel hesitated. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, The people who took Emma. The people who would have taken you too, if I hadn't stopped them. The final piece falls into place. Laura's chest tightened. The people who took Emma. The ones who had come for her first. Nathaniel knew them, and if he had been protecting her, then that meant he had been working with them. Her vision blurred. You worked for them, she whispered. Nathaniel's face was unreadable. I didn't have a choice, he said. If I didn't do what they wanted, they would have killed us both. Laura let out a shaky breath. It all made sense now. The blackouts, the missing memories. She had been a target long before Emma had. And Nathaniel had been caught in the middle. She stared at him, anger and betrayal warring in her chest. You had a choice, she said softly, and you chose them. Nathaniel's expression flickered, just for a second, with something like regret. But it was too late, because Laura had already made up her mind. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about all of it, and she wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. She turned to Grayson, her hands steady. I want answers, she said, and I want justice. Grayson gave a slow nod. Then let's finish this. Laura turned back to Nathaniel, her brother, her betrayer. Tell me everything, she said. Because I swear to God, Nathaniel, if you don't, her voice hardened. I'll burn this whole town to the ground to find out. Nathaniel's eyes darkened. And finally he spoke. Then I hope you're ready for the truth. Because it's worse than you think. Laura felt like she was drowning. The weight of Nathaniel's confession crushed her like a landslide, suffocating and relentless. For 10 years, she had believed Emma was gone. For 10 years, she had endured endless nightmares, reliving the moment her daughter vanished into the cornfield. And all this time, Nathaniel had known. The barn was silent except for the occasional squeak of rusted beams and the rhythmic breathing of everyone inside. Sheriff Grayson still had his gun trained on Sam, but now his eyes were locked on Nathaniel. "Start talking," he ordered, his voice like gravel. "All of it." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. He looked at Laura, really looked at her. "I tried to protect you," he said quietly. Laura's fists clenched. "Don't you dare say that again." Nathaniel swallowed. "You were never supposed to know." "Know what?" Laura demanded. Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That you were the original target, Laura, not Emma. You." The world tilted. "Me?" Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. "They came for you first. When you were a kid." Laura's breath hitched. A memory stirred, one she had long buried, hazy and fragmented. A cold hand grabbing her wrist. A whisper in the dark. A night when her parents had found her sobbing outside, unable to remember how she got there. She had been 6 years old. And now Nathaniel was telling her it wasn't a dream, that it had been real. A family's dark secret. The people who took Emma. "They've been watching our family for decades," Nathaniel continued. "It started before you were born." Laura's mind raced. "Our family," Nathaniel nodded. "Mom and Dad, they were involved in something, Laura. Something dangerous. Something that didn't die with them." Sheriff Grayson narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel hesitated. And then, finally, he told them. "Our parents were part of an underground network," he said. "They were trying to expose a group involved in human trafficking." Laura's stomach twisted. "Not just trafficking," Nathaniel added. "Something worse." Laura barely had the strength to speak. What could be worse than that? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "They weren't just taking people, Laura," he said. "They were experimenting on them." Laura felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Sheriff Grayson cursed under his breath. "Are you telling me your parents were involved in taking these people down?" he asked. Nathaniel nodded. "And they almost succeeded, but the group retaliated." Laura's voice was barely a whisper. "You mean their accident?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "It wasn't an accident, Laura," he said. "Mom and Dad were murdered." A horrible silence filled the barn. Laura shook her head. "No," she whispered. "That's not true. The police said—" "The police weren't on it," Nathaniel interrupted. "Not all of them, but enough. That's why I had to disappear. That's why I let you believe I was dead. Because if they knew I was alive, they would have killed me too." Laura's heart was pounding. "You should have told me," she said, her voice shaking. Nathaniel's eyes softened. "I couldn't. You had to believe I was gone. It was the only way to keep you safe." Laura wanted to hate him, wanted to scream at him, but she couldn't, because deep down, some part of her knew he was telling the truth. A mother's resolve Laura turned Emma, who stood frozen, clutching the necklace that had started this nightmare. She kneeled in front of her daughter, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. Emma's lip trembled. "You looked for me," she said softly. "You never stopped." Laura swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Never," she said. Emma hesitated, then threw herself into her mother's arms. Laura held her tight. She had lost Emma once. She would never lose her again. But this wasn't over. Laura stood, turning to Nathaniel. "You know where they are, don't you?" she asked. Nathaniel's silence was confirmation. Sheriff Grayson exhaled. "Laura, I don't care," she cut in. "I don't care how dangerous they are. I want them gone. For good." Grayson studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's finish this." Nathaniel hesitated, then sighed. "There's something you should know first." Laura narrowed her eyes. Nathaniel's gaze darkened. "They aren't done," he said. Laura's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "They still want you, Laura." The barn creaked. The wind outside howled. And deep in her gut, Laura knew this wasn't over. Not yet, but when it was, she would make sure the people who took Emma and the ones who destroyed her family never hurt anyone again. The storm had passed, but Laura knew the true battle was still ahead. She stood outside the old barn, her breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. Emma clung to her side, her small fingers wrapped around her mother's hand. Nathaniel and Sheriff Grayson stood beside her, their eyes scanning the darkened horizon. Somewhere out there, in the vast stretches of cornfields and forgotten roads, the people responsible for all of this were still watching, still waiting. "We need to end this," Laura said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her stomach. Nathaniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been tracking them for years. They operate in the shadows, but they're not invincible." Sheriff Grayson nodded. "Then let's bring them into the light." And just like that, they had a plan, bringing darkness into the light. The next few days were a whirlwind. With Nathaniel's hidden files, Sheriff Grayson gathered enough evidence to reopen long-buried cases. Reports of missing people, unexplained deaths, and strange activities stretching back decades all pointed to the same group. But they weren't just criminals. They had influence, power, people in high places who had helped cover their tracks for years. Still, Laura refused to be afraid. She had spent 10 years drowning in fear, in loss, in the unbearable weight of not knowing. Now she knew, and that made her dangerous. The night before the operation, she sat on the edge of Emma's bed, brushing her fingers through her daughter's golden hair. "Are we safe now?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura smiled softly, tucking the blanket around her. "We will be soon, sweetheart. I promise." Emma hesitated. "Will they ever come back?" Laura met her daughter's wide, fearful eyes and gently cupped her face. "Not if I can help it," she whispered. And she meant it. The fall of a secret empire when it happened. It happened fast. A coordinated raid, led by Sheriff Grayson and a small but loyal team of officers, took down the group's hidden operation. Laura watched from the sidelines, heart pounding as the people who had stolen her daughter, who had stolen so many lives, were dragged into the light. Some fought back, some tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. Nathaniel stood beside her, his face unreadable as he watched the last of them being handcuffed. "It's over," he murmured. Laura swallowed, her eyes locked on the scene before her. Was it? Could something like this ever truly be over? Perhaps not, but she knew one thing for certain. Her daughter was safe, and for the first time in 10 years, Laura felt like she could finally breathe again. Moving forward, weeks passed. The trial made national news. Laura sat in the front row every day, holding Emma's hand, as the world learned the truth, the names, the crimes, the horrors that had been hidden in the shadows for so long. There were moments of anger, moments of sorrow, moments when she thought the weight of it all might crush her. But then Emma would squeeze her hand, and Laura would remember why she was still standing. Justice was served. The guilty were sentenced. And slowly, life began to piece itself back together. One morning, as the sun rose over the cornfields, Laura stood on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard. Nathaniel joined her, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. Laura exhaled, her gaze never leaving Emma. "I used to," she admitted. "For a long time, I thought if I ran far enough, the pain would stop following me." Nathaniel nodded. "And now," Laura smiled faintly. "Now, I know I was never running from a place," she said. "I was running from the past." She looked at him then, truly looked at him. "And I'm done running." Nathaniel's lips quirked into the smallest of smiles. "Good," he said, "because Emma needs you here." Laura nodded. "And what about you?" Nathaniel glanced toward the horizon, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. "I think it's time I stop running, too," he said. Laura reached for his hand, squeezing it briefly. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The past would always be there. The scars, the memories, the pain, but so would the future. And as Laura watched her daughter laugh, spinning beneath the golden morning light, she knew they had survived. They had won, and they were finally free.